Although university employees continuously talk about higher education, they rarely discuss what it means that they are part of a higher form of education. Instead, higher education is discussed as if it was self-evident what the higher in higher education entails, because everyone probably knows what it is about, right? Some may even find the issue itself problematic in the sense that an overemphasis on the higher part in higher education creates a hierarchy in relation to other levels of education where preschool, first and secondary education are devalued as lower and thus less important levels of education. One way to get around this is by talking about something other than higher education. The terms then that can be used here are, for example, continuing education, where you develop your level of knowledge and skill, which then prepares you for working life. Another could be further education, by which we mean the education received to be able to develop already existing knowledge and skills. In this way, we would thus get away from certain elitist connotations that higher education is then higher, by saying that it is higher. Then, of course, there's always the option of perceiving the issue as not relevant at all, as if there was nothing that made higher education distinct from other forms of education. It is all education, after all, although it is carried out in somewhat different ways. There is therefore really no reason why we should need to talk about higher education at all. I would like to argue that it is problematic to dismiss this question. First, it limits the ability of higher education actors to strategically develop higher education. This is particularly problematic at a time when higher education and its relevance are being debated due to the reasons I mentioned in the previous video. In order for higher education to remain relevant in the future, the purpose of higher education should therefore be clarified so that guidelines for development can be identified. Second, if higher education actors do not want to address this issue, there is a risk that external actors will choose an answer to the question in their place. Their understanding of higher education can then be reduced to serving, for instance, the interests of the market or some ideology. I argue that we should boldly state that it is a significant difference between higher education and other levels of education, while maintaining that those levels of education are, of course, really important as well. But we are not like them. We have our own purposes and even sometimes radically different ideas about what education is for. So, there is something that actually makes higher education higher. There can be many answers to what this essential difference is. The question of what makes higher education higher is actually one of my main research in questions that I return to. And in conversations with educators and through independent studies, I have identified several alternative answers to this. But the answer that I often return to is that higher education is higher because it wants to take students to a higher form of being. Someone who has argued along similar lines is the educational philosopher Ronald Barnett. He believes that, as he writes, a genuine higher education includes the personal development of the student. He urges that higher education has a special responsibility to force the students out of their comfort zones by challenging their norms and beliefs. In this way, higher education can take students to new levels of knowledge, not only in terms of knowledge and skills, but also in terms of self-awareness. What makes higher education a higher form of education is that universities and other institutions of higher education, to the extent that they want to be described as genuine forms of higher education, they require the students to transform into becoming responsible and independent persons. In other words, a higher form of being for the students. Barnett writes, through its development processes, the student cannot just become herself anew, but can become herself for the first time. Her being can move from merely in itself to for itself. She discovers her own voice, is able to articulate it and deploy it to effect. She brings to bear not just her own intentionalities, but her own will. She not just is carried forward, but carries herself forward. I would argue that this higher form of being that makes higher education genuine can be identified as a process of becoming an adult. This has partly a practical reason. Higher education enters into the lives of the students at a time when they are in the process of emerging as adults. The educational psychologist Jeffrey Jensen Arnett has described the condition that people from their has described this condition that people from their late teens to their mid to late 20s find themselves in as emerging adulthood. Emerging adulthood. This is a time when the students, are going through the process from adolescence to adulthood, where they can no longer be counted as adolescents, but not yet fully adult either. In summary, part of the answer then to what makes higher education higher is that higher education comes into the lives of these young people just as they are in the process of emerging as adults. I would argue that this means that we have a responsibility to guide them through this process into adulthood. This responsibility allows us to take the students into a higher form of being, which Barnett argues is necessary for making higher education genuine. Higher education is accordingly unique, invaluable, and irreplaceable, for we carry the responsibility of guiding them, the students, into adulthood, a responsibility that it could be argued that other levels of education don't really have, at least nowhere near at the same level. What makes this insight interesting is that we can then ask ourselves the question, what kind of adults do we want to emerge from higher education? In order to answer that question, we need a deeper understanding of what adulthood means than the one based on such social, cultural, and age-specific markers as I mentioned in the introductory video. We need to go deeper, which I will do in the next video, where we will dust off the German philosopher Immanuel Kant, among others. See you there.